Well, this next decade is pretty exciting, the 30s. Now, we like to call this the messy middle because, and we do this because it hopefully will free you up to feel like you're not alone in the fact that we get it. In the 20s, you have a lot of time on your hands, but you don't have as much disposable income. So it just creates this weird situation. But in your 30s, it's the exact opposite. You're starting to make more money, but now you feel like all your time has been squeezed out because not only do you have more career responsibilities, but more than likely you meet somebody, you also start a family, and that stuff is going to all of a sudden squeeze every bit of free time out of you, and you'll just feel overwhelmed. So we wanted to kind of give you the things you ought to be thinking about while you're in this controlled chaos moment, and it's okay. You'll make it through it, and you'll be rewarded if you do it the right way.
I love what you said, Brian, right there. It's okay. You are not alone. Other people feel like this. So as you go through this, know that you are going through the same path that a number of other folks have done at the same stage. So from a cash flow standpoint, one of the things we want you to recognize in your 30s is that your wages and your income may have grown significantly since your 20s. You're likely making more money. You're likely moving into a different stage of your career. Make sure that your savings follow suit. Don't be a 30-year-old with 30-year-old income and a 20-year-old savings rate. Make sure that your savings matures at the same time as the other areas of your financial life.
Yeah, so I would challenge you on your cash flow. Every time you get in pay raises and other things like that, prioritize actually paying yourself first, because there is something, I think I give people a lot of grace in their 20s because you are trying to work with limited resources. But by the time you're in your 30s, hopefully you're no longer in a job, you're actually in a career. I want you to be prioritizing that 20 to 25% of your earnings are going towards working for you in the future.
And then the next thing you need to recognize is that because you do likely have more income and thus more disposable income, you need to make sure in your 30s you're watching out for lifestyle creep. It happens to all of us. Be careful as your income increases that you don't let your lifestyle increase and outpace how much your savings and wealth building journey is increasing.
I think it's so interesting. In your 20s, you're making decisions that are really hundreds of dollars at a time mistakes. Now, they have a big exponential benefit in the long term, but it's still recoverable from. I think in your 30s, you have to be careful because it's not uncommon for people now to have $1,000 plus car payments, to have mortgage payments that are the substantial sums of money. Your ouchies in your 30s are going to be much bigger than some of those consumer decisions you made in your 20s. So just be very aware that you got to be disciplined and make sure they reflect where you want to be in the future.
To drive that point home, we know that right now the average age of first-time home buyers is actually 36 years old. So what happens inside of this decade? Well, if you look at the data, the median home price right now is $467,000. That's a 42% increase since the beginning of 2020. So these decisions that you're beginning to make in your 30s are large, multiple six-figure decisions. You want to make sure that you're making them well.
That leads to, because that's the housing. The cars I've already kind of alluded to, but I think it's worth sharing some data on this. The average loan term on a new car now is 70 months.
Gross.
What's crazy, that's 6 years that people are close to 6 years that people are doing it. And the average car loan is now, the amount financed is $41,665. The amazing thing when Daniel and I were looking at this stat is to find out how much of this is negative equity that's rolled forward. So in other words, people are financing for 6 years, but they're not owning the cars for the full 6 years. I want you to think about this when you're making any decision with your vehicles. You need to be thinking about this in decade-length obligations. If you're a person that's turning over cars in a very fast manner, you're doing it wrong. These things, I know in the pandemic, we had this unique time where cars actually appreciated. A lot of people are very quickly, just like Carvana and some companies, are realizing, no, we are returning to some semblance of normalcy where these things depreciate like a rock, especially in the first 2 to 3 years. So act and treat them accordingly.
So in addition to focusing on your savings rate, not allowing lifestyle creep to happen, we also want in your 30s you to begin answering the question, do I have a job or am I actually meaningfully moving forward in my career? Have I essentially solve the equation of what do I want to be when I grow up? Because in your 30s, you should begin having some clarity around what it is you want to do for the next 15, 20, or 30 years of your life.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to spend a lot of time with your work family, probably more so than even your evening family, which is kind of a crazy thing. And I just don't want you're still in your 30s, you have enough time to pivot if you need to. And there's some crazy stats that we found on this. Only 33% of workers feel engaged at work, and 61% are trying to figure out how they can leave their current job in 2023. That shows that there's a lot of people that do not wake up in the morning feeling very excited about going to work. And that makes me sad, because I do want you to have a career in your 30s, because if you can have, and you wake up with purpose in the morning, I think you'll find that a lot of the financial stuff just falls into place because you're passionate and enjoy what you're actually working through.
Yeah, if you are in this statistic, figure out a way to fix it. Figure out a way to find either greater contentment or do something that gives you more contentment, because you don't want to be miserable. Because 30-year-old is still young. You don't want to be miserable for the next 15, 20, or 30 years. So as we move into risk management and thinking about that in your 30s, there are now other human beings that are depending on you. Perhaps it is a spouse, perhaps it is children. There are other folks that are depending on you to provide for their well-being. And whenever that's the case, you have to make big person decisions, like making sure that you have appropriate life insurance and disability insurance to protect against those unknown unknowns.
Yeah, go check out. I mean, if you find, what I'm always amazed about is people just don't realize how affordable term life insurance is. If you can just base it off of, if you have kids, when will they actually be done with college? You know, kind of figure out the timing on that. If you need a good base rule of thumb that I've heard a lot of pundits talk about, if you haven't been able to do the full spreadsheet calculation, just look at 10 times your income, add like your mortgage to it, and I think you'll be surprised. It's very affordable for people in their 30s to actually, for a very small amount of money, to get enough coverage to make sure that your family is not left in a bad situation.
In that exact same vein, another thing that happens in your 30s is now your emergency fund, that 3 to 6 months of living expenses, is a non-negotiable. In your 20s, you might have been able to get by running a little bit lean on cash, but in your 30s, you have to make sure that you keep it in place. Again, because there are other people depending on you. You don't want to be out there swimming naked.
And then the last thing to kind of close out risk management is this term umbrella insurance. A lot of people don't realize this. It's exactly what the name implies. Umbrella insurance sits on top of your homeowners, your vehicle coverage, and just kind of protects you from general liabilities that you might be facing. I've told many stories on quite a few other episodes about how this plays, but it's something, if you've never heard the term, go do a little due diligence. You'll find out that you can get quite a bit of coverage, 7-figure coverage for just a few $100. It's worth you investigating this in greater detail.
Another thing that becomes non-negotiable, in addition to an emergency fund in your 30s, is that now you really do need to be saving 20 to 25% of your gross income. We know that for those in their 20s, $1 can turn into 88 by the time they get to retirement. But by the time you get to age 30, that's now dropped to $1 can turn into $23. So your savings rate matters so much in this decade so that you can make sure you're setting your future self up for success. So if you're not saving 20 to 25%, this is the decade where you really need to clean that up.
I also want to remind people in their 30s, don't give up. I mean, this is one of the, if you've been saving for 5 years, 10 years, going on 15 years, you know, a lot of people, especially in a bear market, what we've had recently, a lot of people will be like, man, I hear these guys talk about compounding growth, but I don't see it. This is the point of building up your, what I call boiling point. And the fact that if you think about this, to reach the 212 degrees Fahrenheit, all the way from, you know, room temperature up to 212, it doesn't look like much is happening. That's the same way it works with investing. But then once you reach that critical mass point where it actually, the bubbles start forming, you will be rewarded. So don't give up the journey. It's such an important part of this. But that's the part that where people are getting frustrated. I do want to tell you, when happy days return, I think that this is also the decade where you very well could exceed $500,000, where you maybe want to go beyond index target retirement funds with looking at, you know, tax location and other things you need to consider when you are graduating past the basics.
But even if you graduate, even if you're getting to that point to where, okay, maybe target retirement retirement index funds aren't the solution. I need something more specialized. You also need to keep in mind that your savings rate at this age is still more important than your rate of return. How much you're saving, how much you're putting away should take more of your focus than, okay, what investment decisions I'm making and how am I allocating my portfolio, because your dollars are still super, super, super powerful at this stage. So make sure you're not giving too much attention to, oh, what's my annual rate of return, and focus enough attention on your savings rate.
Let's talk about something that's near and dear to my heart from the 16 years of tax preparation, tax planning was. I think what's interesting about your 30s is, we said, you're starting to get a little more jingle in your pocket. You're making a little bit more money in your career. You're now in this weird dilemma where, you know, when you're in your 20s, tax-free growth is so powerful, and likely you're not making six figures at the very beginning of that it's just a no-brainer. You choose the Roth option, whether it's your employer plan. You just choose tax-free growth. In your 30s, once you start getting in those higher tax brackets, you might have a decision to try to figure out, do I do Roth, where I get the tax-free growth, or do I use traditional savings so I get the current year deduction because I think my taxes will be lower in retirement? Don't overlook how important it is to plan this in your 30s.
But also don't forget, in your 30s, this is the messy middle. This is the time where literally the one thing that we do not have here is time. So this may be the decade where you do graduate to professional. Maybe instead of trying to self-prepare, you say, you know what, I'm going to go hire a professional. I'm going to take that next step, and I'm going to let someone else do my taxes for me so that I can focus on all of the other areas that I need to focus on in my financial life.
We'll leave it to the older guy to talk about estate planning, because I do think this is an important one. As you go through the life changes, you start having a growing family. If you have kids, make sure you have a will, because if you don't have a discussion on guardianship while you're here on the planet and alive, imagine how hard this is going to be for who you leave behind, because we all love our kids tremendously. I know it's a complicated and hard conversation. Don't just assume you're going to be okay. Make those hard decisions while you still have a voice and you make your wishes known today.
And again, make sure that you're updating your beneficiaries. That was something we talked about in our 20s. That same thing is true in your 30s, because life changes. Marriages happen, divorces happen, children get born, grandchildren happen. All of these different things take place. Every stage and age of life, you need to make sure you're reviewing, are my assets set to pass to the people that I actually want them to pass through? Again, I don't think it has to be super complicated in your 30s, but probably needs to be a little more sophisticated than the plan was in your 20s.